In this video, I'm going to teach you all the chess theory behind positions where there are only two kings and a pawn. The side with the pawn is trying to promote it and make a queen, getting into a winning position, while the side with the king can best hope for a draw. Now let's look at a simple example where the pawn is on the edge of the board, also known as a rook pawn. A rook pawn because when we set up a chessboard, the rooks go in the corners, so if the pawn is on the same file as the rook, it's a rook pawn. So the rule for this case is very simple. If the defending king can get into the corner of the board, it's a draw. And the reason for this is very simple, because nothing can kick the king out of the corner. This pawn never threatens or attacks the square in front of it, and the king can never really get to the corner while the opposing king is there. So let's look at a sample line here. So the king's in the corner, and now we can actually extend this rule a little further to say that if the king is in any of these green or now blue circles, it's also a draw, because there's nothing stopping the king from going to the corner from any of those blue squares. And finally, black has no legal moves but is not in check, and therefore is a stalemate, and it's a draw. Alright, let's take a look at another example. In this case, black is threatening to get into one of these drawing squares that allow him to get to the corner. So white has to stop that by making a little wall around the king. Black still tries to get to one of the drawing squares, but white's king steps in and doesn't allow him. Black still tries to get into the drawing squares, but finally when white's king reaches b7, it makes a large wall around itself, and the defending king can never get into it. In this case, the pawn is close enough to be defended by the king and not get captured, and white makes the queen and wins the game. Alright, there's one final rule to remember about rook pawns, and if the defending king can trap the attacking king on the edge of the board in front of his pawn, it is also a draw. So in this case, black is making a little barrier around white's king, and it will be a draw. So black's plan here is to actually just simply run towards the four squares that make it a draw. And the only way for white to stop it is to move the king up and make a little shield around black's king and not allow him to get into those squares. And now black will just move between these two squares, as you'll see. And the problem here is that white's pawn cannot be pushed because his king is in the way. And if white tries to leave and push the pawn, then black is able to get into the drawing squares, just like that. Otherwise, black will just sit and wait, and eventually white will have to push the pawn, and when black plays this move, it stalemates white because white has no legal moves. Alright, that's all the theory behind rook pawns. Now let's take a look at the more juicy parts, which are the non-rook pawns. So what is the rule for non-rook pawns? Well, if we see that the pawn is on this rank, second rank, and we count two ranks up, we see that these green highlighted squares are the key squares. So for a pawn sitting here, the key squares are over here. And if white's king is in any of these squares at any time, white is winning. Of course, the only exception being if black can just simply take the pawn on the next move. So in this case, white is winning. That's all you need to know for now. Alright, so in this case, with the pawn here, the key squares are circled green, but black's king is defending all of them, so white cannot get into them. But let's pretend it's black's move. If it's black's move, he has to move away from one of these squares, for example like this, and now white can get into the key squares and is therefore winning. So a position like this, we call that White has the opposition because it's black's move and he has to give up some squares. So having the opposition means that it is your opponent's turn, and it's good for you. Alright, so there's one other rule. If the pawn has made it past the middle of the board, the key squares only need to be one row in front of the pawn. So if black gets into the, or white gets into the key squares, of course this is winning. We can say that this is winning. Of course, the key squares, two ranks in front of the pawn also applies, but you only need one. You only need to be one rank in front of the pawn. Alright, now let's take a look at how to actually win this. So it's black's move. He has to give up control over the key squares, and the general pattern for white will be to get into further key squares, like for example the orange, and even well, the red if possible, to allow for the pawn push, So let's just take a look at if white tries to move a pawn, that would be a mistake because the key squares have now moved up and white's king is not in them yet. So black will play king e6, actually gaining the opposition because he steps in front of us, and he's stepping in front of us and it's not his move, and we have to or we cannot get into the key squares over here. So he has to play king, we have to play king d4, and now we have the opposition again, and we can get into further squares, and now we can always push the pawn one square in front because the key squares will be here and we're already inside it. But in this case we can also continue to get the opposition and push our key square entrance even further. So in this case we have the key squares for the pawn being here or even here because it's past the middle. So in this case we can safely push the pawn past the middle because we are inside the key squares, and no matter what black does, for example, if black goes here, we can play king up, and now the pawn is escorted till the end of the board. So no matter what black does, he will push the pawn and make a queen. Alright, if black moves here, we can get the opposition one last time, and then we can escort the pawn up the board. Alright, so now let's take a look at how black can draw. So in this case, black has the opposition because it is white's move, and black doesn't have to give up control over any of these squares. So white makes a move, in this case to the left, so black moves to the left as well, keeping all the squares in front of the opposing king defended. He tries to go back, we go back, and white just cannot get into the key squares. If you push the pawn, now the key squares have moved up, and it's even harder. Okay, and in this case, if in every case of the pawn pretty much moving up, black will be able to move back and forth between these blue squares. So if you're in time trouble, you can even pre-move them. And when the king moves up, and you cannot do this plan of moving back and forth, you just move where the king is. So in this case it's over here, so you just move towards it and don't allow the king to advance. If the pawn advances, now the blue squares are over here, you can move back and forth between them, and whenever you can't, you just move in front of the king. Alright, the blue squares once again, just move between them and then step in front of the king. And now finally we have the blue squares where we can move back and forth. And if you can't move to the blue square, you just move in front of the king, and eventually white will have to push the pawn and then either let you capture the pawn, or the only way to defend the pawn is to move over here, which will be stalemate. Alright, so that's the drawing technique for black. Alright, so there's one small little case with a knight pawn. So in this case, the knight starts on the board on these files. So any case with a knight pawn, we will see over here. So in this case, black steps in front of us, gaining the opposition. Of course, we're still winning because the pawn is past the middle and we are inside the key squares. So we're still winning, but it's a little bit trickier to win because if we go, for example, king here, he can come over, and if we try to escort the pawn, right now the king's controlling all the squares for white to push his pawn and queen, except in the knight pawn case there's a small little problem that after the king goes here, g6 is actually stalemate. So the way to win is actually you have to go back, and over here this is the main line, and the only way to win is to actually move the king towards the edge of the board. Alright, and of course if king f7 and we move here, now we can escort the pawn because there's no stalemate tricks because black has a bunch of space to move his king. Alright, and if he moves here, then it just happens to work out. We don't have to stalemate him, black has the square open. Alright, so that's the knight pawn case. Alright, now let's take a look at a study or a puzzle from a very famous chess endgame book called Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. So in this puzzle, white has a pawn over here with the key squares being these over here. So if white can find a way to get into one of these squares, he will be winning. So that's really the puzzle. You don't have to calculate all the way till the end, which is nice. So let's say white tries to just move up. Moving up will just run into black's king eventually, and he is shielding our king, and we can't really do that. Black's king is too close, and even if we try to over here to get the opposition with king d4, we're too far behind. We're still never gonna get into these squares. Alright, so the solution is to play on move 1, king c2, and the plan would be to try to get into this furthest key square from black's king. So let's see, black will try to go forward and stop it, and of course black is able to stop the entry in one of the key squares, but in this case we have the opposition and we will enter the key squares next move. Alright, now let's take a look at a little bit of a trickier position where the objective is to draw. So white moves the king up, and if black tries to move the king to any of these arrows, for example the red, white will step in and gain the opposition and be winning. If the black tries to move to the blue arrow, white will move to the blue arrow, gain the opposition, and will therefore be winning. For example, over here, black has to make a move, and we get into the key squares, and now we're winning. So what can black do? Well, he has to actually wait. So he plays king b6, waiting for white to step inside, and then he can get the opposition. So for example, white will try to go here, black will step in front of his king and gain the opposition, and therefore be drawing. Alright, now I'm going to try to test my skills and win against the computer. So I'm going to gain the opposition by stepping in front of his king, and once again here, and now I can get into the key squares. Now if I push the pawn, the key squares will move up, and I am not inside them yet, so I'm going to try to gain the opposition once again and move up as much as possible. Alright, I can go here. I can even, if I move this, he gains the opposition, and I cannot get into the key squares, so I have to move up a little bit more, and then I can even push over here because I am the pawn is past the middle and the key squares are circled, and I am inside the key squares. So over here I just have to gain the opposition one more time, and then I can escort my pawn to make a queen. Alright, and this is the winning position. So now I'm going to try to draw against the computer from this position, and what I need to do is make sure that white cannot get inside of these key squares. So I'm going to just step in front of him, and notes that if he would have gone here, I would have gone here, controlling all the key squares. So I'm just going to move here, and when the pawn moves up, I can simply move between these two squares until his king tries to stop me, and then I'll block his king. In this case, the computer gives up and knows it's a draw, knows I will be able to draw, and just gives up the pawn and makes the bishop. Alright, thanks for watching.